Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and today we're going to do a special request that I've had requests for, and it's going to be the Neal Avenue, or otherwise known as Lost Avenue. Now, where we're standing here today along this avenue here is probably the most pristine part of the entire Gettysburg battlefield. This avenue looks exactly the way it did when it was built between 1886 and 1890. Now, Neal Avenue, this dirt road, originally was supposed to extend further down this way and meet up in Spangler Spring at Colgrove Avenue. However, it wasn't finished. And today we're going to take you on a tour of Neal Avenue and give you an idea of what happened here on July 3rd, 1863. And I did have some notes that I wrote and a map of what happened I wrote on the outside of a pizza box here. Now, this avenue was named for a man named Thomas Hewson Neal, who was a West Point graduate, and he's actually buried in West Point Cemetery at the West Point Military Academy. Now, Thomas Hewson Neal originally mustered in to the 23rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, which were known as Birney's Zouaves. And in early 1862, he, along with 4 different companies of the 23rd Pennsylvania, were mustered over and transferred to the 61st Pennsylvania, along with Thomas Neal, who received his promotion at that time. Now, this lane represents the line of battle that Neal's brigade occupied on the morning of July 3rd, 1863. Now, Thomas Neal was from Sedgwick's 6th Corps, but he was under the command at Gettysburg of General Slocum of the 12th Corps, and that was because on July 2nd there was a lot of command problems due to the fact that Sickles had compromised the southern portion of the line, and men from the 6th Corps and some men from the 12th Corps on CULP's Hill had to be shifted on the battlefield. Now, where we stand right here was just off the barb of the CULP's Hill hook. And the reason that Neal was placed here by Slocum was behind us in the distance, just over the ridge there, is the Baltimore Pike. Now, 10 roads led into the town of Gettysburg, and at the time of July 3rd, 8 of those 10 roads were occupied by Confederate forces. Only 2, the Taneytown Road and the Baltimore Pike, were still in Union hands, and they were very important supply routes for the supply wagon trains. So it was Thomas Neal to protect these roads so that the Confederate left, which was in the distance over at the Daniel Lady Farm under General Edward Allegheny Johnson, couldn't get onto this side of the flank and then take this part of the field, including the Baltimore Pike, and capture it. So Neal had a specific duty over here on Wolf's Hill to protect the extreme right of the Army, and that's what he was doing. Now, here from his official reports, Neal wrote, "On the morning of the 3rd, Major General Slocum ordered me to take a position and take 2 of my regiments on the extreme right of the entire army and prevent the enemy from turning us. Upon taking that position, I felt the enemy strong in sharpshooters and put my whole brigade in position here and stopped them from going any further." Now, what had happened was Thomas Hewson Neal was on Powers Hill, which is behind us. He took 2 of his regiments, which was the 7th Maine and the 43rd New York Volunteers, and he moved them onto the Baltimore Pike. Then from there, they proceeded past the Peter Baker farm, up the hill that we just walked to get here, and then were put into this line right here. The 7th Maine and the 43rd New York being the next 2 monuments on the lane. He brought those men up here because he felt the strong presence of sharpshooters. Now, the strong presence of sharpshooters that he felt was from the 2nd Virginia. Now, the 2nd Virginia was the old Stonewall Brigade, and the 2nd Virginia brought their sharpshooters up into the earthworks over here on the east side of Rock Creek, and they sent out one company, Company D. And Company D sharpshooters came through that wooded area and skirmished with the 43rd New York and the 7th Maine right here where we stand. Now, the strong presence of these sharpshooters convinced Thomas Hewson Neal that he needed to bring the rest of his brigade up to this hill. So he rode back down the hill on horseback and got 2 more regiments. Those 2 regiments would be this right here, the 49th New York, and then the extreme right, which would be the 61st Pennsylvania. So he brought the 61st and the 49th New York up here to this part of the field to skirmish with those sharpshooters from the 2nd Virginia and also men from the 1st North Carolina. This has been part 1 of Wolf's Hill. We're back up here on Wolf's Hill, and I'm standing in front of the 43rd New York Infantry Monument. And the 43rd New York Infantry, as we talked about on part 1, along with the 7th Maine, which is the next monument down, were the first 2 regiments up here to meet Company D of the 2nd Virginia Skirmishers, who were Walker's brigade, which was the old Stonewall Brigade. Now, I do want to say that Walker was just in command of that brigade not too long. Stonewall Jackson being killed by his own men at the Battle of Chancellorsville back in May of '63, just a couple months before the Battle of Gettysburg. A strange twist of fate, and it's left up to interpretation. Had Stonewall Jackson lived, it is very, very, very unlikely that the 2nd Virginia, or any member of the Stonewall Brigade, or Stonewall Jackson, would have been in a place like Wolf's Hill. He probably would have been more in a prominent position on July 3rd, 1863. So, you had the 7th Maine, the 43rd New York, brought up here by Neal himself. In the distance behind us, on the east or the south side of Rock Creek, you got the Company D of the 2nd Virginia acting as skirmishers coming in this direction right here where we stand today. And these regiments are skirmishing together, putting up quite a fight. Neal sees that. He goes back down the hill in that direction toward the Baltimore Pike, and he grabs the 49th New York from where we shot our first video, and the 61st Pennsylvania, which is at the top of the hill. Those 2 regiments cross on the left and the right side of the Peter Baker farm and advance up in here into the avenue. And while they're doing that, the rest of the 2nd Virginia comes up here to support the skirmishers from Company D. Now you have an all-out skirmish being held right here. Now, behind the camera here, in the distance, this ridge pretty much looks the way it did in 1863. It goes about 100 yards down the hill where it goes to the Peter Baker farm, and then of course the Baltimore Pike, and then just beyond it is Powers Hill. Back on this side, the battlefield extended about another 100 yards into this clearing here behind the monument where the wood line sits. And this was about the extent of the battle here on Wolf's Hill between these skirmishers, other than a small portion of the 1st North Carolina Volunteers. Down here on the right, the 61st Pennsylvania was the extreme right of the Union Army, and then after them, nothing, except about a half a mile today on Highland Avenue Road is the 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry, which were posted a little bit further to the right. But the Union infantry ended here at Wolf's Hill, ending with the 61st Pennsylvania Volunteers. And this action was taken in the early morning, beginning the early morning of July 3rd. So these regiments that were here, by the time the afternoon came, Pickett's charge began to happen. They were actually in a safe position, probably listening and hearing what was going on and waiting for orders possibly to advance in that direction if needed be to repulse the attack. This has been part 2 of Wolf's Hill. It's going to be part 3 of Wolf's Hill. I'm standing here at the brigade marker, and as you can see, it reads Army Lieutenant, 6th Corps, 2nd Division, 3rd Brigade, Brigadier General Thomas H. Neal, Thomas Hewson Neal. He is buried, as I said in part 1, at West Point Military Academy Cemetery. It talks about the regiments that were in his brigade. 6 companies from the 7th Maine, the 43rd New York, which is the monument we just shot in front of, the 49th New York, the one we did the first part from, the 77th New York, the 63rd Pennsylvania. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yet, when you come up here on the avenue, you only see 4 monuments. You see the 49th, the 43rd New York, you see the 61st Pennsylvania, and the 7th Maine. There is no monument up here for the 77th New York. And again, as I stated earlier, that was because the 77th New York stayed behind on Powers Hill to support the artillery that was firing over here in the distance on CULP Hill. This has been part 3 of Wolf's Hill. Okay, I am here doing Wolf's Hill, and this is going to be part 4 of Wolf's Hill. I'm standing here in front of the monument to the 61st Pennsylvania Volunteers. The 61st Pennsylvania Volunteers have the distinct honor of being the extreme right of the Army of the Potomac, as you can read over there on that plaque. And what that means is that the extreme left of the Union Army, which was with Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain all the way back on Little Round Top, extended in the Union official position all the way through Cemetery Ridge and wrapped around the barb of CULP's Hill, and then ended here. And over here is the right flank marker for the 61st Pennsylvania Volunteers. So that means that the last man stood in line right here at this right flank. Everything else on beyond was nothing. He was the extreme right of the Army of the Potomac. So we're standing here on a spot in the Gettysburg battlefield where not many people get to visit. Now, a little bit about the 61st Pennsylvania. Of course, we do know their actions that we did on the first couple parts, but the history of the 61st Pennsylvania was in 1861. They were able to recruit about 600 men. They were a Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Indiana County regiment that mustered in about 600 men by December of 1861, which wasn't quite enough. Regiments were about 1,000 men at the time. There was another regiment out of Philadelphia who was a Zouave attired regiment named Birney Zouaves, 23rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, under David Bell Birney. And their regiment had actually recruited 1,500 men. They gave a higher bounty, they had a fancy uniform, and they sold it really well. They were able to recruit about 1,500 men. And early in February of 1862, while these two regiments were down in the Washington, D.C. area, the Birney Zouaves were in a place called Camp Graham, just north of the Capitol. And while there at Camp Graham, there was an order received that Thomas Hewson Neal was going to receive a brigade command, and that he was to take 400 men, or 4 companies L, O, P, and R, of the 23rd Pennsylvania, and take them away and transfer them to the 61st Pennsylvania Volunteers. And of course, the men in L, O, P, and R were distraught. They fought to fight this fight with their hometown Philadelphia regiment, and now they were being put in a regiment that they didn't sign up for. They signed up and had this beautiful Zouave uniform, and now they were going to have to go to the Federal Blue. So there was a lot of disdain between the men in the Army and the command, and many of them threatened to desert. Many of them refused in word that they would go. However, after a bit of time, the 400 men went, and it was a good thing they did, because this regiment fought in almost every major battle of the Civil War. Spotsylvania, 1st Fredericksburg, 2nd Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, the Peninsula Campaign, Cold Harbor, all the bloodbaths of the Civil War, this regiment was at. And it also has a distinct of honor of having more Congressional Medal of Honor winners than any other regiment in the Civil War, being the 61st Pennsylvania. And most of those, about half of those Congressional Medal of Honor winners, were members of L, O, P, and R, who were originally in the 23rd Pennsylvania. So what seemed like a problem in the beginning later out worked toward the men's advantage. And after the wars, the 61st Pennsylvania and 23rd Pennsylvania had reunions and dinners. A lot of the men talked about the disdain they had during that order and how they did not regret it after a time. So this has been part 4 of Wolf's Hill, in the 61st Pennsylvania on the extreme right of the Army of the Potomac. And I want to do a basic review of what we win. We're now in front of the 7th Maine Infantry Monument here. And we're going to go through a review of what we did. I drew up a little map, which I'm going to share with everyone right here on the actions that happened here, so you can visually see what I put the video earlier on. Okay, and this map here, let me try to find the right sunlight for it. Try to step behind here on the stone wall. There we go. On this map, you can see CULP's Hill, Powers Hill, Wolf's Hill. You can see the Rock Creek, you can see the Baltimore Pike. Okay, on the morning of July 3rd, from over in this distance here, the Daniel Lady Farm, the 1st North Carolina, some members of the 1st North Carolina and the 2nd Virginia built earthworks. They sent Company D out as skirmishers. At the same time, Thomas Neal, with orders to protect the Baltimore Pike, came off Powers Hill with 2 of his regiments, one of them being the 7th Maine and the other one being the 43rd New York. They advanced to the Baltimore Pike. Then they advanced beyond the Peter Baker Farm up to the avenue that we were on today. So right now you have the 7th Maine and the 43rd New York skirmishing with Company D of the 2nd Virginia sharpshooters. He sees the 2nd Virginia, the rest of the 2nd Virginia advancing to join the skirmishers. He goes back and gets 2 more regiments. Those 2 regiments would be the 49th New York, who moved to the left of the Peter Baker Farm in the position down there. He got the 61st Pennsylvania, who moved to the right side of the Peter Baker Farm to the position where we shot our last video at the top of the hill. And that's where the skirmish went on the remainder of the day, where these 4 regiments, 49th New York, 7th Maine, 43rd New York, and 61st PA, skirmished with some members of the 1st North Carolina, Company D, which was an advanced sharpshooters, and the rest of the 2nd Virginia, in this area here where the clearing is in the distance, which also sits to the southeast side of Rock Creek, which runs this way down the hill. Now, one thing about the 2nd Virginia was, and a myth, is that there's the story of Jenny Wade and Wesley CULP. And the legend is that Wesley CULP, who went and fought for the Confederacy as part of the 2nd Virginia on Stonewall's Brigade, when he returned here, he was killed on July 2nd, 1863, near the farm, on the farm field of CULP, the CULP family. So therefore he was killed on the farm field that he played at as a young man. And the problem with that is that the 2nd Virginia, let me repeat that, the 2nd Virginia never fought on CULP's Hill. They fought on Wolf's Hill. Wesley CULP was killed on Wolf's Hill on July 3rd, 1863, most likely somewhere between this stone wall that we're sitting here and Rock Creek. Anywhere along this field he was killed, and possibly still buried there today. He was not buried, most likely, in the Evergreen Cemetery in the CULP plot. And I think the last thing that was ever mentioned was that they found his gun with his initials carved near a tree. And that probably, because Wolf's Hill's next to CULP's Hill, it might have been thought that it was CULP's Hill. Even Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, advancing the Little Round Top in this area, actually thought that he was on, he thought that Wolf's Hill and Little Round Top got him mixed up. So this hill has gotten mixed up in history because there's not a lot of history written on it, and most people don't know what happened here. But most likely, Wesley CULP was killed somewhere between this stone wall and in this wood line here in the distance on July 3rd, 1863, and possibly may be buried somewhere out here on this ground today. This has been the story of Wesley CULP and an overview of the entire battle and the actions that took place here on Wolf's Hill on July 3rd, 1863 on Gettysburg Battlefield. Okay, this is going to be our next part of our Wolf's Hill series, and also Secret to the Battlefield. And this is going to be probably the largest secret ever on the Gettysburg battlefield. On July 3rd, 1863, while the skirmish of Wolf's Hill was happening, there was one officer from this regiment, the 43rd New York, that was killed during the skirmish. And that officer's name was Captain William Gilfillan. Now, Gilfillan was taken from the battlefield off into the distance over here, and he was buried at the base of a boulder, much like the David Aitchison story. But in this case, the men actually piled up small boulders over the boulder he was buried at the base of. And they did that as a tribute and a memorial to him. And when that happened, when he was buried there at the base of those boulders, the story was forgotten about. And a letter was written, and it was taken downhill to the Peter Baker farm in the distance, and it was placed inside the wall. Now, during the restoration of the Peter Baker farm, that letter was actually found by the current owner, Dean Schultz. And he went out searching on the property for this boulder. And one day, while tramping around out here in the woods, he found it. And this is the William Gilfillan boulder and rock. It's the only battlefield monument that's actually built during the Battle of Gettysburg, and there's only a very few people that have ever seen it. And it's right here. This is the Gilfillan boulder right here. This is probably the largest secret on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The William Gilfillan boulder. This has been our next part of our Wolf's Hill series on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook and Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate. Okay, I am here on Lost Avenue, otherwise known as Neal Avenue, and we're going to take our next part here on our series on Wolf's Hill. And this is also going to be Secret to the Battlefield, the Jeremiah Tawney Farm. Now, if you look on some period maps, you'll see that there were several Tawneys that lived in this area over here. There was Jeremiah Tawney, there was John Tawney, and then there was Charles Zephaniah Tawney. And on July 3rd, 1863, as Confederates approached from where we are facing the camera, Union regiments, 4 Union regiments under the command of Thomas Hewson Neal, as we talked about in this video series, came from Baltimore Pike past the Peter Baker farm into this area. And they got into this area, and this is the area that they collided with the Confederate troops of the Stonewall, the former Stonewall Brigade. The Stonewall Brigade came from the wooded area here, heading toward our camera. Union troops got about this far, and over here in this area was the Jeremiah Tawney farm, or house rather. It was a very small house and a well, and this is where the Union soldiers were positioned as the former Stonewall Brigade, including Wesley CULP, collided into them. It is most likely in this area between the Jeremiah and John Tawney farms, or possibly over at the Charles Tawney farm, in this triangle of Tawney farms where Wesley CULP was actually killed. And today, with the permission of Dean Schultz, the property owner, I was given the site of the original John Tawney farm. The only thing that's left is the hole in the ground, the foundation of it, and the well. And we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at that now. As we turn here, you will see what is left of the foundation and the basement of the John Tawney farm, which is right here in front of us, where this hole in the ground is, and you can see some of the foundation over there. If you walk over here, just outside the front door of the house, which sat right here, was a well. And that well, if you're not careful, you can actually fall into it today. It's hidden over here in the brush. It looks much like the well over at the Charles Zephaniah Tawney farm. And it sits right here. That is the well for the John Tawney house, which sat right here where this hole in the ground is, and you see the foundation stones again. Lost Avenue is just up there where you see the stone wall. And of course, about 100 yards to our front in this direction was actually the John Tawney house. This was the Jeremiah, I think I might have said John, but this was the Jeremiah Tawney house and well. And the John Tawney house sat over here, and then to our left, about a half a mile, was the Charles Zephaniah Tawney farm. Big triangle made. Now, I also want to mention that the path that we walked on to get here was the original farm lane that led down here to the Jeremiah Tawney house. And actually the wall that we come up to here on Lost Avenue is the original wall that was the wall that was put up by Confederate troops that they fought behind. The other side of the avenue, that wall was actually a park rebuild. When they got the property in the 1880s, they established a lane. They put property markers on each side where the lane would be established. They used the one original stone wall, which is the one in front of us, and the other one was a rebuild. This has been our next part on our Wolf's Hill series, and also Secrets of the Battlefield, the Jeremiah Tawney House and Foundation. Standing here on the Baltimore Pike, which is just here in the distance, right here at the Rock Creek Bridge. And we are today looking at the Peter Baker Farm. Now this farm is one of the most pristine farms in all of Gettysburg. The side that you see on the right there where the siding is was actually a 1.5 story log house that was built in the year 1760. Now in just before that, this Baltimore Pike, which ran to Baltimore, had just started becoming a major highway in America. In fact, the house that you see here in the distance, which I did a video on, was the G. Fleming Hoke toll house. And it was where at one time using this road required that you collect a toll. Because it had been a major way for traders to go from one large city to the next. And the Peter Baker Farm sat here. This farm sat here. It was actually part of the Manor of Mask from the William Penn descendants. And we'll look at the plaque on the front of the house. Again, the right side was a 1760 log 1.5 story structure. Now, the left side of the house was built after the American Civil War around 1880. But during the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, especially on July 3rd, 1863, this house and the property behind it, which is known as Wolf's Hill, became part of a skirmish. And I did a video series called The Skirmish at Wolf's Hill, where I talked about the brigade under Thomas Hewson Neal and the 4 regiments that fought against the old Stonewall Brigade, including Wesley CULP. Now, this farmhouse was lived in by Peter Baker and his sons during the battle. And as we talked about in the videos, casualties from that action were actually taken downhill from Wolf's Hill to this house, and there was some type of operations in the house, because in the right side, in the parlor, there are still blood stains on the wall. Now on the house itself today, there are several initials. Peter Baker had a grandson named Albert Baker, and Albert in 1918 carved his initials on the front of the house, on the addition part of the house. He put AB 1918, and that's it right there. And then of course the Manor of Mask. Harry Baker actually carved his initials in the wall. Now the Baker family, Dean Schultz, who lives here today, actually then put his initials on the side of the house. And Dean himself actually knew the Baker family, the descendants of the ones that were here during the battle, and therefore that's where a lot of the information and history surrounding the Baker farm actually comes from. It comes from the historian Dean Schultz and his wife Judy, who have resided here for most of their lives. And again, the video series that I did on Wolf's Hill, as well as this video on the Peter Baker farm, have to be courtesy of Mr. Dean Schultz and his wife Judy Schultz, who have been so gracious about sharing the information on their property. This has been the Peter Baker farm. Next part on our series on Wolf's Hill, and you see my car, it's parked at the very dead end of Clapsaddle Road. And the original Clapsaddle Road went in this direction. Now, as we looked at earlier in our video preceding the Jeremiah Tawney farm, I talked about Confederate forces heading toward Wolf's Hill from the John Taney farm. And the John Taney farm was right here. This pile of rocks is actually the foundation of the John Taney farm. This is what's left of it. Like the Jeremiah Tawney farm, this was also a house that had been torn down or caved in or went into a state of disrepair over the years. And of course, not much is left of it, just the well and the little bit of the foundation around the house. But this is the John Tawney farm. So now we've actually done videos on all three of the Tawney properties. The John Tawney foundation and house site, which is this one here. The Jeremiah, which Confederate forces crashed into Union forces under the command of Thomas Hewson Neal at the Jeremiah Tawney house up near Neal Avenue. And then we did a video a couple years ago on the Charles Zephaniah Tawney farm as well. So the Tawneys lived in a big triangle. One here, one a couple hundred yards in the distance of the woods that way, and then one over here in the Spangler's Meadow area. This has been our next part on our continuing series on the battle or the skirmish of Wolf's Hill here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook and Gettysburg Battlefield Ultimate.